Because regardless of whether you're doing indie pop or metal, all of these steps can help you. So I wanted to respond to a viewer request for a song by Wet Leg. So I recreated their song Chaise, Longue, but in the process, I felt like there wasn't really enough here to make a whole video about. But then in the process of me recreating this beat, I realized I made all of my guitar and bass patches for this song from scratch, and I realized I haven't really talked about that process before. So today what I want to do is walk you through my process for creating a guitar patch or a bass patch so that you can craft your own guitar tones, mainly focusing on indie pop, but you can really use these techniques regardless of what genre you make. I'll walk you through some of the guitars that I use and why I use them, different kinds of amps, and how to put those finishing touches on a guitar patch so that you can get them finished and polished and then saved as a preset so that you can use them in the future super quickly. But before we get into all that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I work as a producer under the name Velvet Ear. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to create their own music at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you watch this video and you think that we would have fun working on a project together, check out the top link in my description. So on to the rest of it. So we're not really going to be focusing so much on the song today, but it is kind of a recreation, so I'll just show you what that sounds like. First step to making your own guitar tone is your choice of guitar. We're going to be sticking to mainly electrics for today. And if you are very new to guitar and guitar tone stuff, the main thing to look for when we are picking a guitar is what type of pickup does it have. So my Strat here has single coils, meaning it's going to be a lot brighter and a lot more jangly. There's going to be a lot of clarity in it, but it's not going to be able to handle high gain as well. Not that you can't use it for high gain stuff, but it's just something to keep in mind. The next kind of pickup we're going to look at is a humbucker, which looks like one of these guys. It's two single coils put together. Sometimes they have a metal covering over the top of them like this one. And the thing to note about humbuckers is they're darker, but they tend to have a lot more meat on the bone sonically. And the reason they're called a humbucker is because they tend to buck the 6-cycle hum that normally occurs with a single coil pickup and distortion. And then the last pickup are P90s, which look like this. They're normally the size of a humbucker. They kind of look like a bar of soap. And for any of you who are guitar nerds, yes, I know this is a Jazzmaster and it's technically not a P90, but we're just using this as an example. You're going to see this sort of rounded shape with this big piece of plastic with some screws in the middle. And a lot of people love P90s because they sort of sit in this range between a humbucker and a single coil. Like from a technical standpoint, they are a single coil pickup, but they tend to have a little bit more of a bark to them. And the reason why it's kind of important to know these different kinds of pickups is because when you're trying to recreate a guitar tone, if you get this part wrong, you are going to struggle with it the rest of the way. Like I have this Telecaster here with single coils in it, and if I wanted to get this sort of modern, chunky, heavy metal sound with the pickups that are already in here, everything that I use this guitar on is going to sound really bright. There's going to be a lot of noise. It's going to be very jangly, and I'm going to be fighting it the whole way through, and I'm not even going to be able to get the sound that I'm looking for. So for this track, the main guitar part is this lead that I did. So when I went to track it, I used my Jazzmaster because I didn't want the super bright clarity that something like my Strat or my Tele would have. I wanted it to be a bit darker. And while I could have used something like my guitar with humbuckers in it, I also wanted it to be a little bit untamed, a little bit noisy. And so that process of elimination brought me to this guy. The next thing that is important for you to do when you are building your guitar tone is your amp choice. And the reason I have an emphasis on these two so much is because 90 to 80% of the guitar tone that you hear is going to be done through what guitar you choose and what amp you choose. Because if you play a guitar into an amp, whether it's a real amp or an amp sim in your DAW, if it doesn't sound 80 to 90% of the way there, you need to either A, fiddle with the knobs a bit on the amp to see if maybe you're not on the right channel or if you need to add some EQ, or B, you just need to try a different amp or a different guitar. If you're feeling like the tone that you're getting is only like 40 to 50% of what you want it to sound like, you need to go back to these two steps. So let's go over some of the main kinds of amplifiers that you're going to encounter in indie pop. Here, let me squish this here so you can see it. One of the main amps you're going to run into is the Vox AC30, which sounds like this. guy's been around for a while. It's very common in the worship world. So you've probably heard this on a lot of CCM stuff. It was also what the Beatles used on the Ed Sullivan Show. So it's kind of a classic. That demo that I just played was me through my Jazzmaster, which is what I'm going to use all these guys for. But I would say use an AC30 when you want something that is either A, more vintagey, or B, is very clean. When you start to push the drive section of this guy, the overdrive tends to sound very vintage and fuzzy. Next thing we're going to look at are Marshalls, which sound like this. So right away, one of the things that you can hear about the Marshall is that its ability to add a lot of gain to a signal is way more than the Vox. A lot of people love this guy for lead tones because it's just so gain heavy that you can really have it cut through the mix. And as you could hear, when I turned it to the low gain setting, the clean setting didn't sound half bad. And then we're going to look at a couple of Fender style amps. This first one is based off of a twin reverb. We also have this, which is based off of a classic Fender Tweed amp. So you can hear they all sound pretty different, and they all have different voicings, almost like a microphone, and they also have different stages of gain that they can go to. Again, those are not the only kinds of amps out there, but if you're overwhelmed by options, I would start with those three kinds: Voxes, Marshalls, and Fenders. So for the guitar tone on Chaise Longue, I wanted something that was very vintagey, that was very drivey, but wasn't like super modern high gain. So I ended up using a Fender Tweed with this distortion pedal, which is a great way to voice your tone differently. But if I just take that amp off and replace it with an AC30, you hear how like the throatiness has kind of gone away and it's a lot brighter, versus if I replaced it with a Marshall. You can hear that there's a lot of that throatiness again, but the gain is also just kind of a bit hotter, and then back to what we had. Again, getting your guitar tone is 80 to 90% what amp you're choosing and what guitar you're using. And the next thing we're going to look at is what I like to call pre-amp processing. Not necessarily a preamp, but like literally before we go into the amp. So let's say we've got our Fender Tweed amp sound. Here are the main kinds of pre-amplification processing that I'm using. The first one, which is honestly, in my opinion, one of the most underrated ways to process your guitar, is an EQ. You can completely change the voicing of your guitar DI into almost a completely different sounding guitar using just EQ before your amplifier. So here, let's just loop that lead line here, and I'll show you what happens when I boost and cut certain frequencies of the DI. Show you even more how it can like save a tone, let's use something like a really distorted Marshall. You hear how like woofy that is? Like imagine if we liked that amount of distortion, but we didn't like how like throaty and woofy all of that is. What you can do is you can take an EQ here before your guitar amp plugin, and we're just gonna high pass it a little bit, and then maybe do like a cut here in like the lower mid-range to higher low end range. Versus you can hear how much the pick is like making the amp throb. And we can even do the inverse of this. If we wanted to get a bit more drive out of the amp, we could actually boost those frequencies. So insanely versatile. Another way that I like to process my guitar DIs before they go into my amp is with a little bit of compression. Now, I know that there can be some controversy around using compression before you go into your amplifier. And for those of you who don't know what that controversy is, the idea is that you're using a lot of dynamics when you're picking your guitar, and a compressor can kind of level out those dynamics and make them all hit the front of the amp the same, kind of removing the feel of your playing. And while I agree that on some level that can happen, something that I'm far more interested in is making sure we're hitting the amp consistently. So here, let me just add in a little bit of this fast compressor, which is almost like a Boss compressor pedal. And we're just going to do a couple dB of gain reduction going in. And then if we feel like it's getting a little bit too drivey after that, we can just pull down our makeup gain. So right here, let's listen to it with compression. You can see it's jumping a lot when I'm going to that higher note. And then when I turn it off, you can hear I wasn't like the best at like gain matching that real quick. So it's overall less distorted. But the biggest thing that I noticed listening to that is that me picking the note is changing how distorted the guitar sound is. Like if I'm lightly picking, it's not as distorted. If I'm picking harder, it is distorted. And when I add the compressor, it's just sort of lightly distorted the whole way through. And then the last thing that is sort of a staple of pre-amplification processing is noise gate, which is basically a way to keep loud, distorted guitar tones from being buzzy and hissy whenever you're not playing. So this is really useful if you're doing something like a single coil sound and there's a lot of hiss. You can just throw this guy on here and it almost acts as like a volume automation thing. It will just cut the sound of your DI unless it gets over a certain volume threshold. So when this red light is on, it's clamped closed, and when the light turns off, it opens up. It's a great way to keep your tone clean. You just got to make sure you're not bringing this guy up too high, because otherwise it will actually clamp down on your guitar playing and actually like cut off notes. But that's how I process my stuff going into the amp. So now we can look at post-amp processing, which is all the things that you would do after you've already got all these other pieces in place. All right, again, going back to it, your guitar choice and your amp choice should be 80 to 90% of it. And then we're going to get the last 20% from this guy and this guy. So another way that we can post-process is, again, EQ. Now that we've gotten our actual guitar tone, we're almost going to sort of mix it a little bit just so it plays nicer with the rest of our songs. So there are a few things that I'm always doing. I am almost always high passing. To what degree you high pass it depends on the actual guitar part itself and what genre you're in. But for a lead line like this, we can actually high pass it up to like 200. So if you listen with it on, like we're high passing it up to like 220, but we're still getting enough of that throatiness that we want from that lead line because we're playing so high up on the neck. And if I turn it off real quick, it instantly becomes a lot more boomy, and it's taking up a lot of low end that we don't need it to. And then we can look at low pass filtering. I almost never need anything above like 15K in my guitars. For this guy, we've been able to like low pass it to like 10K because there's nothing above that range that I feel is integral to the sound. So with both of these filters on, with both of these guys off, it just feels like it's taking up so much more space than it needs to. With low frequencies, I would say it depends a lot on the actual sound that you're going for with your track. I normally don't need to touch this guy unless there's like a lot of boomy low end that I want to tame. I do often cut around this 300 range. So again, when we're using these EQs, we want to make sure that we're keeping them as broad strokes. We're not doing like surgical EQ stuff here. And then we're going to do the same in the like 1 to 5K range. Again, we're not trying to get like a final mix sound. We're just going to make the EQ moves that we know that we're already going to be making when we mix often, so that we don't really have to do them as much. This like low shelf and high shelf, I pretty much only use those if I need like a textural thing. Like I need a little bit more air with the sound overall or a bit more beef with the sound overall. Here's with it on. Here's with it off. It's like, it feels like that one lead line is taking up the entire mix. So some post-processing EQ really makes it play well with other instruments in the tracks. And again, we're also going to be looking at compression as like a post-processing layer. So now we're no longer adjusting the compression of the DI going into the amp. We just want to do some very light volume shaping so that it's consistent coming out of the amp. I normally like 1176s for guitars. Sometimes I might use like an LA2A. When you're choosing a compressor here, it really just depends on how okay are you with the compression being sort of audible and crunchy. Because if you want it to be light, I would probably go with something more like an LA2A. But if you're okay with it being more aggressive, I would use an 1176. But yeah, for this guy, let's just do like a 4-to-1, some slow release, some faster attack. So before, when we were doing compression, it was adjusting like how distorted each note was going into the amp. And this compressor doing it afterwards is more so taming the volume of the sound overall. So going from note to note, it's not going to be jumping in volume as much. And to tame that just a little bit more, we're going to go to the last thing we're going to look at, which is limiting. A limiter is just a really aggressive compressor, and I just do this at the very end. If you're going to save this as a preset, I would actually turn it off for a bit until you know that you're no longer going to be recording anymore. Because what we're going to do with this guy is just tame the peaks of those transients, just so we don't have anything harsh poking over the edge of this guy. So we're just going to lower this limiter knob until we see this guy start hitting red, which means that we're limiting. And boom, I feel like we've made a tone that is very practical. And apart from this EQ out here in Ableton, which you could very easily do with some of the EQs here prior to this, you could just save this guy as a patch and just have it in your pocket to pull out whenever you're doing a session and you need this style of tone. Because regardless of whether you're doing indie pop or metal, all of these steps can help you. So real quick, let me show you all of this processing turned off just using the amp and the guitar. And then everything turned back on. Personally, for me as a mixing engineer and a producer, that second tone is going to be a lot more practical for me to use just because it's not taking up this entire frequency spectrum. And then if you want, you can do this exact same process with bass. The only difference is you're going to be looking at bass specific amps. And when you're looking at basses, you're going to be looking at, is the bass an active pickup bass or a passive pickup bass? And you can tell that normally by whether or not there's a battery on the back. But as you can see, I kind of processed this one exactly the same. The only difference is I used some bass specific distortion and amps. And it sounds pretty freaking consistent. I just feel like these tones are really practical. If you guys would want more of these, please let me know. I've thought about making like an indie pop tone pack for something like Guitar Rig 6, but I just wasn't sure if anybody would actually want it. So if you would like something like this, let me know, because I would love to make a pack that everybody can use. And yeah, that tone finding technique is how I made the bass tone, these guitar layers underneath it, and this sort of doubled up octave lead. And mixed with some drums, it sounded like this. Yeah, hopefully you guys found this video helpful. I love explaining how to make guitar tone stuff, so this video is kind of an indulgence for me. If you like this kind of video, please hit subscribe, bell icon, all that stuff below. And yeah, I will see you guys next week, where we'll be looking at my last look at the 1975's new album. Needed to wait a little bit for this one because kind of did all of them at once. But yeah, I will see you guys next week.